Okay, good morning. I'm very pleased to present the French report. I have to say it will be rather short. It will take 10 minutes only, because I was asked to do a replacement a bit on short notice, and since I was still struggling with the keynote speech, I thought, okay, I will do what I can, and I will focus on a few points. But I hope I can bring you some, picture of what's going on, a bit debates. I will also pick up some topics because I see it was possible from reports. So I will focus on funds and corporate governance and the interaction also between the two. I will not speak too much on product governance. Why? Because it's like in other countries, there's no debate in France really right now. People are waiting for implementation, and this has not been debated too much. So I discover some issues in your report, in a sense, and but I not discuss in France that much. But there are other discussions on other points. Okay, so when you look at sustainable finance in the EU, I have to say, just to give a big picture, that France has a long tradition in terms of trying to steer activity toward the common good. And this has to do, of course, with the influence of the French state and the general interest view in France. So capitalism was always looked a bit like suspicious. When what the state touches must be good, you know. And so this is this kind of intellectual, framework which makes everything which is sustainable, which is not capitalism as such, nice. And this reminds me when I was a student in high school, we had to learn at the time before the fall of the Berlin Wall. I remember well the geography books. So on one side was the US, and they were described, as, of course, sexful, but, very wild. And then on the other side, I had to learn the Soviet system. I remember having to learn the production of iron, from the Emil DDR. And I thought, this is rubbish, because we all know it's a system which doesn't work, but you had to look at this. And this was presented as another model. And France was presented as the good balance, between the two. So the idea that, the third way, basically. And of course, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, then we became, the most, let's say, not so liberal capitalism, and we try to improve this. But which means that anything where you are working not just for money is ingrained in France as something which is acceptable. Of course it's acceptable, but it's not a big issue. Okay, in France, there's also an issue in terms of who can drive these kind of agendas, because the French state, basically sold a lot of its assets, privatized a lot. So it's not like in Poland, it's not like in many countries. They still have some influence. They all 10 or 15% here and there. But, and of course it's the state, but sometimes they even get, crushed by the voting majority, and we cannot do anything. So this happens. And we don't have pension funds in France, because we have a system of retirement where the money is spent immediately, which means there's no strong investors from for retirement, like in the US. So the situation, but we have investors still, because we have a large fund industry in France, very large. So I checked yesterday, it's almost 5 trillion assets under management run in France. So we have a very large fund industry, and this is what has been targeted in terms to drive the agenda towards, sustainable whatever, and they have been quite active. So France has this huge, asset base, so to say. And otherwise, if you take the listed companies, then what do you find as shareholders? You will find, 4 categories, basically. First, very often you have a controlling shareholder in France also. Or might not get 50%, but 25% in a large listed company, this would be enough. So many French companies are controlled, which means so they will be subject not so much to external pressure, but also to some internal pressure. Lots of this, and then also for the biggest ones, but not so much control, of course. The biggest of the biggest, let's say Total, if you're like this, and then who control them? Because we don't have pension funds. Well, this is US pension funds, or it's Fidelity, it's Vanguard, it's BlackRock. So there's a huge influence of foreign investors. There were statistics 20 years ago that some companies were basically foreign-owned in France. Of course, they were not foreign-controlled, but they were foreign-owned. So all these agenda get in France, basically through foreign investors, these large institutional foreign investors, or through the national asset managers, which are based in France, which are also pushing in this direction. So this is the, let's say, overall situation in terms of let's say, environment. Now, in terms of sustainability, France has been always, since 2001, it's very clear, there was a kind of shift towards pushing for sustainable agenda in listed companies. It started in 2001 with an act which said that listed companies needed to report on non-financial key performance indicators. So it started in 2001, this was the shift. And since then, it has been growing and growing and growing. I will give more examples. So this is the first one. France is very much attached to this and disclose everything which is sustainable, so environment, social issue, whatever. So it starts 2001, and this was quite influential at the EU level. Because of course, France has a seat. So the NFRD directive, basically, of 2014, was driven by France. So it's the EU translation, in a sense, of the French 2001 Act. I mean, of course, updated, extended, whatever. But France was pushing for this, and in France, people are very proud to say, well, this directive is basically our brainchild, because we push for it. France pushed for it. Of course, it was only successful after the great financial crisis of 2008. Before, people say, well, the system is working well, you can do your own stuff, but there's no issue of sustainability, blah, and so on. So give it a break. If you take also this SFDR, the SFDR also was pushed by France and is heavily influenced by an act in France of 2015. So you see this. And then you have an extra push from France because with Brexit, now in the room, I have to say, you have France and Germany in a sense. And France is pushing very hard on lots of its pet agenda, so to say. And with the UK out of the room, the counter pressure has, in a sense, disappeared. It can come from other countries, of course, but Brexit has increased the French influence there. So you have even more, which might be coming. And now, so just to give a picture, compare, for instance, to Netherlands. So the French state was condemned in 2021 by the highest administrative court to fight climate change, to do more effort to fight climate change, because the French state is bound by the Paris Agreement. So there were NGOs who filed a complaint and say, you have to do something. And the court said yes. But contrary to Netherlands, there was no case against Total where they would have been sued to reduce their targets, their oil emission. So the state has been targeted successfully, but not the private sector on this. So just to give a picture in terms of sustainability. What has happened for Total, for instance, is basically, or the others, it's two things. We have this Vigilance Act law from 2017, which has, it's basically like the corporate social sustainability due diligence directive. And they have been sued in France against Total, for instance, because people say, well, you are not, your plan is not good enough, but it got clogged in the court system because they went to the wrong court. So there was a ping-pong situation where they went to wrong court, and then the NGOs got fed up, so basically they called Ministry of Finance or Justice, and they said, we want you to draft a law where we have to go. So this was done last December, so now we will go to civil courts, because we didn't want to go to commercial courts. Because at first, we have to go to commercial courts, but commercial courts in France, especially Paris and Nanterre, so Total is based in Nanterre. So, sorry, in La Défense, you know, the high-rising towers, it's the circuit of Nanterre. And Nanterre, and also in all courts in France, at first-degree courts, it's a mixture of, I mean, it's not a mixture actually, it's 100% elected judges from the commercial community. So in Paris or Nanterre, of course, it's bankers, you know, it's it's the business side, basically. And of course, the business side is not, I mean, enthusiastic about this, and they thought it was unfair, blah, 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 so there were legal discussion about whether it was the right place to go, I mean, legally, and then they just call the ministries and say, get us out of here and put us into the civil court, because here you have professional judges, which are, I have to say, more left-leaning. So they feel it will be better there than with the right-leaning, of course. Guys who are used to be in their former life, bankers or whatever, entrepreneurs and so on. So that's the overall situation, a very favorable environment for everything which is sustainable, with just the caveat that in France, usually the state is considered to be the one who has to drive all the changes, not the private sector. France is, the state has to do it. But, okay, the state reduces influence because less money and so on. So the private sector has been pushed to do more, and this is what we're looking at. Okay, a few things about fund industry, then I will look at corporate governance. I've already expired my 10 minutes, so it's bad. Fund industry, so you have two types of rules, I would say. You have law, which has developed since 2001, and even before, and you have also the private sector. Because the industry is so huge in France, of course, they come also with their own standards about, climate disclosure, this kind of stuff. So if you look at the fund industry, what you've seen is in the 90s, early 2000, the government started to create special purpose funds were directed at being good, So social investment, sustainable investment funds. There were also funds for employees. So we have funds from employees since a long time. This dates back to De Gaulle, basically. And De Gaulle was always saying we have to find a way between capitalism and socialism. One of the ways was to give money to employees. So you have in many companies, of course, large ones, employees who are shareholders, indirect shareholders, actually. Indirect shareholders through UCITS. So company UCITS, which invest in the name of employee for retirement purposes. So this was one of the targets for saying that they could also be forced to take into account sustainability stuff and so on. So you have this, and then you have the general fund industry, and this is interesting. As soon as 2001, a law was passed, the same, which also requests more disclosure, which forced UCITS, French UCITS, to vote at general meeting, or to explain why they would not vote. So it was a comply-explain situation where they were forced to vote or intervene. So the idea was, these guys, they have influence, and they should influence the company. So this is 2001. This is 15 years, more than 15 years before SRD2. This is a push in this direction to vote in order to be, let's say, influence management. And this has developed, and there have been several laws again, and the latest two are interesting. One is 2015, in terms of sustainability, where the management companies, they have to explain to their subscribers in their report how their investment policy takes into account criteria relating to compliance with social, environmental, and quality of governance objective. So they have to report since 2015, especially about sustainable issues, ESG stuff. So one, they have to vote since 2001, and they do vote, by the way. I mean, it's a comply, explain, but of course they do vote. And second, now they have to report about ESG-related votes in their reports. And now, since last year also, since 2021, these management companies, they also have to publish a voting policy report explaining how they voted. So not just how they will vote, but how they voted. So you have a legal system which is rather coherent, where they have to vote, and now they have to vote, they have to have a policy on ESG, and they have to report on the ESG policy on this. Private sector also was quite active. You have various bodies. The most important is called the Association pour la gestion financière, so Association for Financial Management, which is the body which develops code of best practices and so on. Also, since 20 years ago, they started to push in this direction, so complementing the law, often being ahead of the law, basically, and pushing in these directions. You also have a lobby group which is called Paris Europlace, so which is the big lobby group for the financial center, which also is pushing a lot on everything which is green, saying Paris is the green finance place for Europe and so on, and also pushing with standards and so on. So there's a lot of activity, and then also you have a so-called Forum de l'investissement responsable, Forum for responsible investment, which is made of management company, UCITS, bank, academics, NGO, and so on, which publishes requests. And the last one, they put questions to the meetings, such as, I'll just give an example. Please provide a list of your activities that are incompatible with the Paris Agreement. And what do you do to reduce this? What's the part of your percentage of your capex which is aligned with the Paris Agreement? I mean, this is very precise. Huh? Do you have a definition of living wage, which is above the minimum wage? And do you try to increase this? So it's a large group, so they are pushing in this direction also. And governance also, what do you do in terms of tax allocation, gender quota, or gender pay? Okay, now second part, corporate governance in companies. Well, France also has been quite active in VU, I mean, compared to other countries in VU. In Zone 1, as I mentioned, the listed companies had to report on non-financial key performance indicators. And with time, this was extended, from social issues and then environmental. So now it's large what we have to do. So from every 3, 4, 5 years, something new is added to this. So you have a lot of disclosure by this listed company about anything which is ESG. And ahead of the EU. So this was all done before the EU asked for it. And of course, then France says, I want to export this to the EU level. And then you might be aware of this, 2019, there was a local pact, and this is just the shortcut. And the pact law changed the definition of social interest in France. So first, it introduced the definition of social interest for all companies, by the way, not just for listed. Because it's in the civil code. So Article 1832 was changed. And now this article says that the company is managed in its corporate interest, intérêt social, taking into consideration the social and environmental issues of its activity. And this, in a sense, was, I would say, my view when I commented on this, is it's a kind of, in sense, recognition of what was already there. Because France was always a stakeholder system anyway. I mean, this was not in the law, but you could see it from the case law, you could see this from the articles, from the Code of Corporate Governance. This was clearly a stakeholder jurisdiction oriented, makes sense in this environment. But it was not written as clearly, so this was done by this law. And I mean, last March, actually, so 1 month ago, we had a change, we dropped on this article. Now it says, taking into consideration the social and environmental, so social, environmental, and then they add cultural and sporting issues. Yeah, sporting issues. I had a laugh, I have to say, when I saw this. Cultural and sporting issues. So this is, I see the trend, it's like a trend going in that direction, I see the trend. It was a law about sport. And someone, the French Senate, had the idea to say, well, because it's a law in the sport, companies have to do something, so they put sport, probably, I didn't check, I didn't have time to check, probably in the debate, say, well, what about culture? Yeah, then, you can add up the list, it's endless. So I had a good laugh when I saw this. I didn't spot it because you don't expect, to see the Companies Act being modified in a law about, how to, develop sport in France. And then you end up with a definition of social interest where you have to put the culture and the sport stuff. I like it. So maybe training sessions, in the companies, whatever. I don't know what they have in mind. But this is typical, This is going to be. So now I have to look at every law which is going to be filed because you end up with protection of biodiversity in the sea, whatever. Okay, now the debate which is taking place in France, which I would be interested to get the views also from the audience, is climate, say on climate. This is the big debate right now, especially since the general meetings are taking place now. So I've just been enrolled into a working group which is thinking about doing some stuff. So I will give you the legal framework and what is taking place now. Legal framework is, in France, the board of directors is entitled to run the company, of course. And the general meeting has some powers. And France has a very, let's say, strict organization, so which says that you cannot strip the board from its powers to give it to the general meeting. So in 1946, there was a decision called Mott, which is basically still, of course, valid, which says that you cannot take all the powers to give from the board and transfer them to a general meeting. Fair enough, but it doesn't mean there's no flexibility, of course. You could give some powers. So the issue is here. Can you accept resolutions on certain climate? So this is the big debate, and of course, you can put resolutions to the general meeting if you have 5% of the vote, or less if you are listed, and you have a big debate here. So lots of companies, I mean, the business community is very much against. And I think they are wrong to oppose completely. They say, we don't want this. We say, according to the law, it's not possible. Well, I don't agree with them. I told them, be careful, because if you oppose right away, you will just be crushed. So be flexible, and try to be a bit more clever. And so there's a debate about whether the French government should legislate on this. This is agitated by the French security supervisor, who say, if you don't do anything yourself, the law will intervene. We ask the law to intervene. So it's bluff, actually, because they don't want the law to be intervened. I know it's bluff, but the bluff, of course, can work. And of course, actually, it's working because there was an industry group which was set up, where I was asked to be there, to develop some analysis so that we have kind of code on this. So this is what is going on. And in terms of resolution so far, what happened? Well, last year there were, for the big CAC 40 companies, so the largest ones, like DAX, Dreisig in Germany and so on, there were 3 resolutions which were filed, but all by the management board, about CSR, climate, and this, so it was limited. And now you have resolution being filed again by minority NGOs, basically, holding some shares. And Total was targeted, because Total is really the bad guy in the room. They are targeting Total again and again and again. And 3 days ago, Total refused to file the resolution, because they said it's against the law. Because what they were asking, basically, they are saying, well, you want to define the strategy in the shareholder meeting. And this is against Mott. This is against this case law. So this is, so the fight is on, in a sense. And if the case is taken to court, then we'll have the first decision in France on what you can do with certain climate. My personal view, this will be my conclusion, is certain climate will come in any case, so you will have to stop. But the question is, devil is in the detail. You cannot force the company to be micromanaged by the general meeting. So if it's just, some kind of large directions, but in the case of Total, the resolution which was blocked, they were quite prescriptive. So if they go to court with this, to try to force Total, I think they will lose. So it's a question of balance, So this is coming, but we have to wait for a court if they do file, a court complaint on this, and otherwise there will be this report which will be published, I guess, in September, which will say this is, what is acceptable. I don't think there will be a law on this. Nobody really wants this, and we can work without it. But this is really the topic of the day in France. Thank you.